Good evening. I'm Rabbi Aaron Bisno, and I'm the senior rabbi of Rodef Shalom congregation in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Before I say anything about this evening's program, I want to share a few housekeeping details. Please know that we have arranged for simultaneous closed captioning, which you can access by clicking the closed captions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Further, this evening's lecture is being live streamed to Rodef Shalom congregation's YouTube and will be recorded on Zoom and will be available after our program through our sponsoring organizations and again through Rodef Shalom's website. Please also know that the chat is available and we will be sharing information with you there that you may need, as well as you're communicating with us any questions or technical issues you may be experiencing, and then any questions you may wish to ask of our speaker, and those will be collected and shared in your name afterwards. Any concerns you have or communications you want to make with us, we invite you to communicate with Olivia Tucker or Rabbi Elliot Kleinman, both of whom will serve as our evening's moderators. And after our speaker, Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion's president, Dr. Andrew Rayfield, has spoken, I invite you to avail yourselves of the chat to proffer your questions there. It's now my privilege to welcome you to Rodef Shalom Congregation's annual Ruth and Bernard Levar Memorial Lecture. Originally established by the Levar family to honor the 50th wedding anniversary of this beloved couple, today and for many years now, after the passing first of Bernard and then Ruth, beyond her 100th birthday, and what a special occasion that was, the now Memorial Levar Lecture continues to celebrate this couple's extraordinary love for their family, for their congregation, and for Reform Judaism generally, and their commitment to challenging ideas and contemporary thought. And certainly we will honor that commitment tonight. This love for Reform Judaism and its essence is evidenced today in this family's ongoing relationship with Rodef Shalom, and in each of Ruth and Bernard of blessed memories families' continued and active engagement in their respective communities and their congregations across this country, here in southwestern Pennsylvania and in the Midwest, on the West Coast and southern Florida, and an active and ongoing involvement in the organizations of our movement. In particular, we are fortunate to be joined tonight by Ruth and Bernard's children, Marcia Levar of Pittsburgh, and Barbara and Don Werner of Sharon, Pennsylvania, and Palm Beach, Florida, as well as Ruth and Bernard's grandchildren. We have with us tonight Susan and Beth and Marty, as well as extended family and friends of the Levar and Werner families. Additionally, we at Rodef Shalom are joined for this year's Levar Lecture in a significant way by many beyond Pittsburgh, as we are joined this year for the first time by three co-sponsoring organizations. First, my alma mater and the oldest Jewish seminary in North America, the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, which our speaker, Professor Andrew Rayfield, leads so courageously in such complicated times. And we are joined tonight by the women of Reform Judaism, with which the Levar family has been involved and has helped lead for many decades. And we are grateful for WRJ's ongoing support of the Hebrew Union College and its students and our diverse and multifaceted Reform Jewish community. And we are, for the first time, joined by a new partner, Sketchpad out of Chicago, which energizes and strengthens an open Jewish community by promoting collaboration and innovation for Jewish nonprofit organizations and professionals. Further, Sketchpad stimulates a cross-fertilization of ideas, further invigorating our communal landscape, a model for all of us as we go forward. Finally, it is my privilege to welcome and introduce to you Susan Morrow, granddaughter, Ruth and Bernard Levar, and longtime friend of Reform Judaism and our speaker in particular. Susan.
Thank you, Rabbi Bisno. I appreciate that introduction. Thank you for the warm comments about our grandparents. We were very fortunate to have them as role models. I'm really excited to be able to be here and be part of my grandparents' lecture series. Obviously, living in Chicago, I've not been part of a lot of them, but one of our silver linings to COVID, we get to cross the miles, join with friends and family, and share great conversations. In 2019, my aunt reached out to me to ask for ideas and input on a speaker and a topic. I told her I had the perfect speaker. I told her that when I attended Kutz Camp reunion a few years before, very sadly, Kutz closed this past summer. Well, at the reunion, I had time to reconnect with lots of amazing people. And one old camp friend had just become head of HUC-JIR. She couldn't believe that I knew, let alone had gone to camp with the head of HUC-JIR. Well, Andrew Rayfield had just begun his tenure as the 10th president of HUC-JIR and was in fact a campmate of mine. I've always been grateful for the connections Jewish camping has afforded me. I reached out to Andrew back in the early fall of 2019. He was booked for over 18 months. We were so disappointed. Well, as COVID has persisted, I asked my aunt if we could pivot and create a Zoom program, and here we are. My family, Marcia, Barbara Dawn, Beth, and Marty, and I are pleased to introduce Andrew Rayfield and welcome him to Rhodef. Dr. Rayfield has had a distinguished career. He's been a leading political scientist and Jewish communal leader. His career has bridged both academic and professional worlds as Associate Professor of Political Science at WashU in St. Louis and is President and CEO of the Jewish Federations of St. Louis. He brings a deep commitment to Judaism and Jewish values, a proud understanding of excellence in the mission and impact of Jewish nonprofit agencies and institutions. As a member of the search committee said about him, he is a distinguished academic and creative thought leader. Andrew is uniquely qualified intellectually, spiritually, and professionally to lead the College Institute in our mission to transform the Jewish community and the broader world. Andrew brings to HUC a passion for teaching and scholarship, as well as exemplary leadership skills that set him apart as a dynamic visionary and community builder. No one could ever have envisioned where our world would shift when Andrew was inaugurated. He has shown incredible ability to shift and lead in these changing times. Personally, I'm amazingly impressed to see where my fellow Kutz campmate has come to this point and can't wait to see where he will help us all grow and change. I'm grateful for the topic Andrew chose for tonight. As we all know, racism is front of mind for almost everybody today. Andrew, thank you for being with us this evening, and I'm looking forward to hearing your comments and hear your vision towards justice. Reminder, there'll be time for questions at the end. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Rayfield.
Susan, thank you so much for that introduction. We were just reminiscing beforehand that I think it was, 7 or 8 years ago that you and I sat in that song leading class in high school. I think maybe 9 years ago.
That's all, just a few.
It's really an honor to be with all of you this evening, and I want to thank you and the community for the invitation. It really is a special pleasure to follow in the footsteps of my predecessors to deliver the Levar lecture. I want to thank Rabbi Bisno in particular for his leadership on behalf of HUC and for our entire reform movement. It's felt deeply within the Rhodef Shalom community, and I've seen it at the one conference I went to, I feel like before we went into COVID, we were present, and it's very much felt through the Jewish world. Rhodef Shalom has a distinguished history, and at HUC, we're really pleased to be part of that. Rabbi Solomon Freehoff, Walter Jacob, and now Aaron Bisno are all treasured alumni. HUC is proud of all of our alumni supporters and friends who keep Jewish life vital and exciting here in Pittsburgh. And I hope that I am able to join you here in Pittsburgh, where that word actually has meaning beyond on a virtual screen. We also have a long history of partnership, and our future together, I know, will be even more exciting. 36 years ago, the Ruth and Bernard Levar lecture began with the simple purpose of advancing Jewish thought in the public sphere. Tonight, we're joined by their daughters, Marcia, a stalwart of the Rhodef Shalom community, and Barbara and her husband, Donald. And I am especially pleased, as I said at the beginning, that Barbara's daughter, Beth, and her sister, Susan, a friend, as I said, from our days in URJ Kutz Camp, could be with us. Susan, thank you for the lovely introduction, for initiating this 18 months ago. And thank you and your entire family for making this evening possible. Tonight, I'm pleased to discuss a set of issues that are important to me and our work at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. And they deal with how we approach our work advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're all values that I know are widely shared, not only at HUC, but at Rhodef Shalom, our reform movement, and increasingly and thankfully throughout our world. Now, the recognition that diversity is important can sometimes leave us the opportunity to think about why diversity is important. Sometimes the things that we find ourselves holding on to as just givens, we don't oftentimes take to reflect deeply upon. And tonight, that's what I want to speak about, because I believe that our values are strengthened as we understand the reasons we have for holding them and endorsing them and pursuing them to the fullness that will mean. Now, sometimes when you pursue ideas and the reasons that you have for them, you run into places where other ideas have to shift. And as I'll discuss, I think that is part of what we are seeing and what we will strengthen our fight against racism for doing by working this through in ways that will become clear during the evening. As you can probably tell already, I come at these questions not only as the president of HUC, intent on deepening HUC's commitment to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also as a political theorist, a political philosopher, hoping to think through with you what the moment we are all living through right now means for all of us as a Jewish community, and how we can move forward combating the worst forms of racism by committing to work we have to do on our own and in our own communities right now. We shouldn't think that the diversity and inclusion we're talking about is of the other, but is just as much about what we need to do to recognize the diversity from within. So with that, and I thank my partner, Rabbi Elliot Kleinman, who is sharing the screen for us and helping our Chief Engagement Officer. So as I said, the talk tonight is going to be called Beyond Racism, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Jewish Call for Justice. And I want to do three main things in the talk. The next slide, please. Number one, I want to talk through the four reasons that I believe diversity, equity, and inclusion are important. And they include the fact that we need to include different perspectives and life experience, that it's valuable to have different interests at the table and within our community, that we benefit from having role model effects that strengthen our communities by both inspiring people and aspiring to great things. And finally, that a diverse community, as well as a decision table, a place where decisions are made, signals that fairness and equity are in the process both of bringing people into whatever community it is, as well as the decisions made, generates a sense of legitimacy for them. Number two, I also want to talk about how this confronts moving beyond, it's not beyond racism, but how it's going to confront some ideas we have of racism. Because as I think we'll find out as we delve deeper into the reasons that diversity, equity, and inclusion are important, we're going to find that for them to be effective, to really promote them, we actually have to treat individuals differently on account of their race, their gender, and their identities. And that's sometimes is all that the definition of racism is. And so I think it's going to have to force some uncomfortable feelings about maybe our definition of racism needs to be refined so that we understand what we are fighting and what we're not fighting because of our importance of DEI to combat the worst parts of racism. And finally, what I want to raise up is what I call the Jewish call for justice, that our commitment to these things is dependent on actually something different than diversity, actually valuing our own particularity. And our own particularity, that is to be able to draw on Jewish wisdom and build Jewish community, depends on promoting Judaism as a definable identity worth having that's different from others in its own right. And so how do we fit that with our conception of diversity, inclusion, and equity? And you can go on, Elliot. This is, as I said before, DEI is a particularly important commitment to me at HUC and for all of us, something that I'll conclude with. I'm going to start in a much different place, though. I'm going to start in 1955. I'm going to start with the Supreme Court. And I know this may seem odd, but if you look at this picture, you could say, what's wrong with it? Now, hopefully you'll notice what's wrong with it. Yes, it's bad lighting. And yes, the draperies that they're wearing appear to be cut from the same cloth as the drapes that they're in front of. But of course, what's wrong with this picture is that we have the Supreme Court, one of the three branches of government, that are filled exclusively by white men. And Congress didn't look a heck of a lot different, and certainly the White House until recently didn't either. But interestingly, don't forget that this, go back there, that Elliot, please, that this Supreme Court is the Supreme Court that delivered Brown v. Board of Education. That is the signal court case that began to transform the civil rights movement. So you can't criticize them necessarily. You can criticize them on a lot of things, that they're not too liberal. It's how they look. And that was, of course, changed in 1967. Go ahead to the next slide. With the appointment of Thurgood Marshall by Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president. And suddenly you had radical diversity for the time. Obviously, a single African-American does not diversity makes, but it did represent something very important. So imagine, this is the Supreme Court in 1971, 4 years after Marshall started. Imagine the surprise when 20 years later, if descriptive diversity mattered, when Justice Clarence Thomas was appointed. And for those of you who remember that time, George W. Bush appoints Clarence Thomas as to replace Thurgood Marshall. And what is important to recognize is that the appointment preserved racial diversity on the Supreme Court. Now, I probably don't have to tell anyone here, but Clarence Thomas turns out to be one of the most conservative justices in the history of the Supreme Court, compared to Thurgood Marshall, who was one of the most liberal justices. So one of the things of the appointment of Clarence Thomas, even though it maintained racial diversity on the court, it nevertheless showed that racial diversity is more than just about descriptive diversity. It has something to do with other reasons that diversity is important, other than getting a Supreme Court that looks more like the nation it represents, but it has something to do with other reasons. And if you look at today's Supreme Court, of course, the current justices on the Supreme Court, number one, the political diversity is different. All kinds of categories. You have racial categories, you have gender categories, you have religious categories that are diverse. You have political parties, you have different law schools that people went to. And you could think again about the different benefits of this kind of diversity. The diversity of interests, they represent different interests. They have different perspectives based on their life experience or where they went to law school, how they think. They strengthen the diversity of the court, strengthens our nation. And you could think about this in two ways. Number one, they provide role modeling effects for women, for Jews, for Catholics, for sure. There's one Protestant, Neil Gorsuch, although he was raised as a Catholic. And it provides a model of a fair process. It indicates a fair process. Now, we know the controversies over the last few years of the appointment of the justices, so I'm not going to say too much about that. But I'm saying just if you took a snapshot of it, you wouldn't think that there was something wrong just because of the diversity. So obviously there's more complexity here, but hopefully you get the idea. So coming back to this and going back to the main themes, what can we draw out of this? And I think that we can draw is that there are four important aims of diversity. These may not be the only ones, but that these are important. Go to the next slide, please, Elliot. And we can see these as interlocking. There's the inclusion of perspectives, there's the inclusion of interests, there's role modeling and belonging, and there's fairness, equity. I don't think I mentioned belonging before, but let me just say it now, that when you see a diverse group of people in a group, you feel like you could belong there if you can identify with them. That's whether it's a Supreme Court, that's the role modeling, or in a community, in our Jewish congregations that are increasingly serving an increasingly diverse population. If they don't look like the people that we're serving, it's going to keep them, it's an invitation in if they can become more diverse. So just a few comments about this. Notice from this graph that diversity is a means. It's not an end to these other important moral and pragmatic objectives. And this is important. If diversity were a means, then we could just increase diversity by changing the heights of people. Well, we have 6 foot tall justices and 5'4" tall justices. And we could do things by arbitrary sort of things, by whether or not you dye your hair or you shave your head. Diversity in and of itself is not a value. It's a value as a means. And that means being able to identify which features at any given time are in fact important. And it's going to change depending on the different times that we live in, times and circumstances. Also notice that the aims that we're aiming at may conflict with one another. We just saw that with the Thomas and the Marshall example of the Supreme Court, where Marshall maybe had both role modeling and perspectives and interests that were tied to this, the African-American community. Clarence Thomas had fewer of these in terms of his representation of the median position of conservative versus liberal within the African-American community. So you could get one without the other. Sometimes they're aligned. And finally, each aim may require us to treat individuals as carriers of group traits. So the only way that, in fact, we can say that Thurgood Marshall represented the African American community is, in fact, if he had certain traits of perspectives of what it meant to be African American, or of the interests, et cetera. And that's where the sensitivity gets in, that, well, this is sounding a little bit like racism, and we want to be very careful about it. Now, even though I started with the Supreme Court, I want to bring us back to our own tradition, because it's not just in modern day that we see this. We also see this in the Bible. And a very important story, the 12 spies. So just to set the picture, it's the book of Numbers, and you have Moses amassing 12 spies to go scout out the land of Canaan. They're about to go in and take the land if they can. They send out 12 spies. And here's the quote. And God spoke to Moses saying, "Send you men that they scout the land of Canaan, which I'm about to give to the Israelites." This is important. "One man each for his father's tribe, every one of them a chieftain." So notice that, one man each for his father's tribe. So what kind of diversity is being promoted? Tribal membership. You want a diversity, there are 12 tribes, and you have one for each tribe. Now, why would you want this diversity here in this case? Well, remember, interest, perspectives, role modeling, and fairness. What's the interest of the tribe? Well, actually, the tribe of Dan is going to be settling the very northern part of the land, and the tribe of Judah, the more central or southern part of the region that they're inhabiting. So they have different interests. They're going to look for different things. Number two, the perspectives of the tribe. Maybe growing up within one of the tribal areas in Egypt before, and then already in the wilderness, changes how one thinks. Maybe role modeling and belonging. Think about the 2 million Israelites that were left behind for the 12 that were spies. They see that, yeah, my tribe matters because one of ours is there. I belong here. And finally, fairness and equity. We have confidence in the report they're going to bring back because we know that all of the perspectives, all of the interests were represented. So the idea of diversity and equity is baked into the political narrative of the Hebrew Bible, and in multiple ways, not just in this one. So going back to this idea of inclusion of perspectives is where I want to begin and talk about how the inclusion of perspectives. I want to walk us through each of the 4 reasons for diversity. So we begin with the inclusion of perspectives, and I want you to begin with this picture. You'll see a picture in a minute of Rabbi David Lau. I'm confident you will see in a moment. There we go. This is an Orthodox rabbi, a chief rabbi in Israel, and somebody that views halakha, Jewish law, and the world in a very specific way. And we can be sure that his view of diversity looks a lot different than this other rabbi, a graduate of HUC, Rabbi Susan Talby of Central Reform Congregation, really been a pioneer of social justice work, and stood and marched proudly with the Black Lives Matter movement. And the two could not be more different in their perspectives that they bring to the work that they do. And there's something about having the value of both of them. If we want to talk about a really diverse Jewish community, both of them at the table, they're going to think about things in very different ways. So if we think about perspectival diversity, though, being a member of a group means that an individual is likely to have a different experience than those outside of that group. The reason that I could speak of Rabbi Lau's experience being different than Rabbi Talby is that Lau comes from an Orthodox experience. So I can say something based on the group that I know that he's part of, similar Rabbi Talby. In point of fact, I'm a personal friend of Rabbi Talby, having lived in St. Louis for 18 years. So I can say more than just the group association. I can say something, but even without it, you could presume that. And that leads to some challenges when we promote having a member of any identity group at the table for the purposes of diversifying perspectives. We're treating them as individuals based on characteristics of the group to which they belong. And that, of course, we need to remember that not all individuals share equally in the characteristics that make up a group. That's the check that we make. That's the thing that we take to the extreme point, is what we reject racist or discriminatory language. Well, that person's one of this group, so they must be X, Y, and Z. And yet what we're doing here with perspectival diversity is we are projecting. And so let's try to make sense of that so that we can still retain this very important feature without running into the problems. And I think the way to get at that is to look at the difference between internal and external identity formation. And I want to begin by talking about the subject I know best, and that is me. So here's a little collage I put together of my identity as I think about it. And it really has four most important parts. Number one, I'm Jewish, very core to who I am. You might have realized that already. Number two, I think of myself as a musician, a folk musician, a singer of Jewish and other songs, James Taylor, the Beatles. You might also know that because I got the guitar right here and I've got the poster of Paul McCartney right over here. So that might have given you a clue too. Number three, you see the books in the library right there. And that's because I read all the time and I think of myself as an expansive thinker and writer. I don't always think as rigorously or write as good as well as I like, but I do it. And that's really important to me. And finally, as a father and as a family person, somebody that is here to support my children. My wife went back to work 6 weeks after the kids were born. I was in graduate school and did a lot more of the childcare at that point. And it's very important to me, the idea of a nurturer and supporter of their development. So that's how I view myself. So how do other people view me? If you shift the lens, well, number one, they still viewed me as a Jew. That's the first. But number two, instead of a musician, as Elliot's put up, they see me, this is my inaugural picture, as president of HUC. And I get that, because I am. And that's how they interact with me. That's how they hear me. That's how. Instead of the third one, a broad intellect necessarily, they see me as in my lane about politics. Now, admittedly, this one I sometimes promote. Look at what I've been talking about right now. I'm not maybe as broad, but that's their limits. And finally, and maybe most importantly, instead of seeing me as a family man, they see me as Michael Chiklis. Well, not literally as Michael Chiklis, but rather what this is representing is they see me as a white man that is very direct, that's very strident, an alpha male I've been called. I weigh in, my height is a little over 6 feet with shoes, and I get it. And I have a position of power. I'm white, I have influence, and I get a lot of the privilege that comes with occupying that status. I could tell you the backstory about growing up as a kid that had some weight challenges, as a kid that failed 9th grade, all of which are true, as a kid that struggled with my own identity, but that doesn't matter. And I'm not pleading any sort of, oh, woe is me, because I do occupy a place of privilege, and that's how I get treated and how I interact with the world. Those things shape me, but it's not just people like me that have power and influence. Let's go to the next slide. This is Professor Raquel Adler, and she's a professor at HUC. And the challenge, particularly for those that don't enjoy identities that are expressed on them, is that you get defined by others. I never ask myself, she says, am I, Raquel Adler, a Jew? Just as I never ask myself, is there really a God? These are both facts I know from my internal experience. They form the core of my selfhood, how she defines herself. My pain and the pain of other committed Jewish women lies in the discrepancy between our internal and our external realities. There's some kind of pull. And it's not just for Raquel Adler, of course. This is the challenge of many minorities. If we go to the next slide, how others treat us has consequences. There's a great story by W.E.B. Du Bois. Can you put up the next slide? In Dusk of Dawn, about a Black professional who during the Jim Crow era lives in the North and enjoys a professional status with relatively less discrimination. And it is only when he takes a train down to Georgia and crosses over the Mason-Dixon line that the conductor comes out and says, you need to go to the back of the train. And the quote is, the Black man is the person who must ride Jim Crow in Georgia. That is, he's treated and he's labeled as Black, an identity that was not nearly as important to the character as it becomes to other people to define him. It's not only the experience of African Americans in the early 20th century, mid-century. We have one of our own, Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher. The Jew is one whom others consider a Jew. No matter how hard you try, you can't get out of the gaze that others do and press upon you. And if you think about the history of Theodor Herzl, for those of you who know it in the founding of Zionism, it's his observation that no matter how the Jew would try to integrate into society, society would treat him, her, them as not as the Jew, the label. And finally, moving to contemporary time, the philosopher and the poet, Adrian Piper. What joins me to other Blacks and other Blacks to one another is not a set of shared physical characteristics, for there is none that all Blacks share. Rather, it's the shared experience of being visually or cognitively identified as Black. So think about these three things. We don't get to define ourselves, other people do. And it raises the question, racism, sexism, homophobia gives to others the power to define what is most important about us, about who we are, and then to treat us differently. And I will add, worse, based on how they define us. Let's keep this slide just for a minute. No, keep this slide, please, go back. Worse is the point here. That remember what I said, the same thing happens to me when I walk in a room and people see an alpha male that's a little over 6 foot, that's president of HUC, that's white and enjoys privilege and start interacting with me. But I hardly call that racism. And I think it violates what we mean and the power of racism as a moral term to simply apply it to an individual, even when we're applying their identity to them. There has to be something that is devaluing of them, that gives racism its moral oomph. Okay, go ahead to the next one. If this is right, and I think it is, it explains then how others see you, why perspectival diversity can track a group, even though we only are engaging with an individual. This is driving while Black, this term that's used for African Americans in our society who are pulled over because cynically, ironically, and sometimes with good data behind it, it seems their only crime is being Black. And the conversation, the stories that are told of African-American families who have to sit down with their children to have the conversation about what to do when they're pulled over. And you put your hands on the steering wheel where they can be seen so you don't pose a threat to the officer. My father and mother never had to do that for me. I don't have that kind of experience, and that doesn't define who I am. But I can tell you that odds are greater if you are an African-American male that you have had the experience of having that conversation, of having to navigate a world where that has happened. And that's something that I don't have a perspective with. Now, it doesn't mean that every African-American has that any more than every woman has experienced sexism, but it does mean there's a greater likelihood, just like there's a greater likelihood that I, as a white man, have experienced privilege and access to power and influence simply on account of my race. So that's how we can tie the individual to the group with, I think, differentiating the problems of racism from the benefits of doing this to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay, we'll go through the other four much more quickly. This was the one that took the most time, but let me just go through the inclusion of interests. I don't think this will be particularly controversial. It's important that we include different interests. This is another reason that having a diverse group of decision makers in particular is important. Go to the next slide. Having people with different interests in a group or community ensures the full effect of a decision is more likely to be understood before a decision is made. It ensures that academic discussions and deliberations are going to be enriched. It ensures what the community takes to be important can be deepened and strengthened because you have people with different interests that can bring them to the table. So that's number two. Again, I don't think that's very controversial at all. Number three, let's talk about role modeling and belonging and how important this reason is to the promotion of diversity, both in our communities to communicate a sense of belonging and to inspire aspirations of what you can be. You think about Barack Obama as the first African-American president. You think about Kamala Harris, the first African and Asian woman who is vice president, how they are inspiring people to aspire to more. Think about our own community. Go to the next slide. This is a picture of Sally Priesand 50 years ago, next June of 22. So in June of 72, she was ordained as the first Reform rabbi, the first female rabbi in North America. And having done that, she has inspired dozens, countless, hundreds of women to become rabbis. And there's a funny story of a family that the little boy asked his father, he'd grown up in a world that now there's so many women rabbis. He said, "Dad, can a man become a rabbi?" Sadly, gender equity is still a challenge that we are facing in the reform movement. So I'm not making light of that at all. What I am pointing out is how big an effect role modeling can have. It's not just for women. Go to the next, it's also for Jews of color, welcoming them in, not only for the sake of bringing them in, but for the sake of them drawing in and being communicative of that you belong here, that we are a diverse community, that we have to embrace belonging. And finally, just the other one that is particularly salient, LGBTQ plus. I'm confused by this. This is an LA group, the JQ group. Just representing the fact that we want the inclusion of individuals from diverse groups to inspire and aspire to roles they're members that the groups have been previously excluded from. Okay, let's move on to the fourth reason, fairness and equity. Now, this one's actually interesting. Not that the others were uninteresting, but this one's particularly interesting. One of the things that we know about an all-white Supreme Court, we said it indicated something about the fairness of the process to get to the Supreme Court. And when you have an all something, it's looking like maybe the decisions that are being made to assign that scarce good is not fair. And so in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, I think into the 1980s, the symphony orchestras were primarily men. And there was one simple rule that was adopted that dramatically changed the makeup, and it had to do with the selection of people for symphonies. Elliot, go ahead and play the video.
Think of this as the blind audition step. In the 1980s, orchestras began holding blind auditions to deal with gender bias. Musicians played behind a screen that blocked them from the view of the judges. The results? The number of women in top US orchestras has increased fivefold.
So here, Elliot, stay on this for a second, because here's a question that just something to point out. When we talk about racism and we talk about changing the psyche of the individual, that's certainly important. But I think sometimes another way that we can go beyond racism is to recognize that these implicit biases that we have are not so easily changed by education. They're not so easily changed by good intent. We need structured rules to help us get over the very implicit bias. We don't feel, we don't see, it's not bad intent, but it still happens. The screen is a good example. Go on to the next slide. The question that we have to ask ourselves, how can we create our own screens? That is, rules that improve on ourselves, that impose on ourselves to help combat implicit bias. What rules could we take on? Because not more training, not more education, as important as that is, not more finger wagging to each other, to ourselves, oh, we need to be better, we do. Not more morally righteous preaching, which we need to remind us of the importance, but what actual practical steps, screens. And I'll just give you two examples from recent history in our own community. Number one, if you want to understand the experience of Jews of color, we can understand that when they enter our spaces, they're not treated as if they are part of our spaces. Now, that may come from some statistical regularity that is true about the number of people of color that are identified that are or aren't Jewish, but who cares about that? Let's adopt a rule that whenever we see someone entering our spaces, no matter what they look like, we greet them as members. We say their name or we introduce ourselves. Hi, I'm Andrew. Who are you? Rather than turning to them and presuming by the way that they look that they don't belong. And number two, by trying to establish measurable targets and meeting them for diversity, and not just throwing up your hands and say, well, I guess, we did the best we can. If we aren't willing to impose structured rules that we're going to follow, to impose screens, we're unlikely to combat the very deep biases that we have. Okay, so let me move now to the next sort of big thing. So we talked about the 4 reasons for diversity. I want to just talk about beyond racism for a second. If we ignore the reliable ways that individuals experience the world based on how others treat them, we can't fight the most pernicious effects of racism, right? But if we presume that each individual has the experience of the group, we risk falling into discriminatory biases. That's the challenge. So if racism, discrimination of any kind is defined only by the application of group characteristics onto a person without tracking intent or whether it has a positive or negative impact, we can't make progress on diversity because we have to reject all the things I just said because it involves assigning group characteristics to individuals. So moving beyond racism involves constructing institutional limits on ourselves, screens and other things, and also maybe narrowing our definition of racism to actions that in fact cause harm, in fact promote injustice, rather than simply actions that categorize group characteristics onto a person. So I know this is complex and very sensitive. We'll have to figure out how we can navigate this. Let's turn now to the last piece of this talk, and that is to the question of the Jewish call for justice. Here's the tension that we're facing right now. And Elliot, you can stop sharing the screen just for a second. The tension is that we have a question now. We've just talked a lot about why diversity is important, diversity of our own community, inclusion, leading to equity, et cetera. And we're doing it from a real sense of Jewish call to justice. How do we embrace this diversity and the importance of it, even while honoring the distinctiveness of our own tradition? The distinctiveness of Judaism as separate, as worthwhile, as something that we ought to invest in and study and identify as Jews and not as others, not Jews and others, although there are lots of cross identities, but it's Judaism for its own sake. How do we come to recognize also the subgroups within us, the diversity we talked about, women and Jews of color and LGBTQ plus Jews, et cetera, without threatening that which binds us together as one people, as one, and we could say the same thing as one nation and even as one world. So elevating diversity as an end in and of itself can be corrosive to the collective purposes that we're trying to achieve as a community, inspiring us to work on behalf of each other, for the greater good. We begin to honor the other only as other, rather than seeing the virtue of diversity as a tool to achieve those other ends of inclusion. We want our communities to be more diverse in certain respects, and thus to consider who's included inside. But once inside the tent, we have to remember they are one of us. So we have to do both. And in this sense, I'm going to use an image that has been used frequently to talk about inclusion. And inclusivity demands that our communities should be open to all, but we have to recognize that our community has boundaries. And what we're inviting, we have to ask, what are we inviting others to be included in? What's inside the tent? What defines the inside that outsiders are being invited into? We cannot neglect the sacred distinctiveness and value of Judaism and Jewishness for its own sake that we all share, even as we're honoring the diversity within. And even as we're honoring in other contexts, the diversity from out. For example, the staffs of many of our Jewish institutions need to be diverse in all kinds of ways, even beyond and members who are outside the tent too. So how do we address this? I believe we address it by drawing on our own tradition. And the passage that I want to use is from Leviticus 19. And it's essentially, love your neighbor as yourself. You shall not take vengeance, and you shall not harbor a grudge against the members of your people, says Leviticus, and you shall love your fellow man, that's the gendered language, as yourself. And what's really important here, as you see in the red, God may be able to love the whole world at once, but we first must come to love our neighbor as ourselves. And the critically important thing is we can't get to love of all, love of humanity, unless we start first caring for ourselves, our community, our religion, our nation, our values, and then humanity. Go ahead to the next slide. The intersection of circles. which goes back to Aristotle and Edmund Burke and other great political philosophers. And we understand that actually by cultivating that third level, the group identity, the value of being Jewish, we're on the way to cultivating and extending out our care to others beyond ourselves. So it's critically important. I'm going to end with just three great quotes from very important scholars on this idea of valuing ourselves and embracing the distinctiveness of our tradition, even as we're recognizing the diversity that's going to strengthen us all the same. Number one from Susanna Heschel, being open to the positive changes inclusion brings about, but also the challenges. Here a question arises. If feminists do indeed bring about all the changes their critique implies, what will remain as recognizably Jewish? What criteria, what grounds of authority will be used to retain some aspects of Judaism while rejecting or radically modifying others? So she is completely in favor of change and dynamism. If you know her work, she's one of the most important Jewish feminists of the 20th and now the 21st century, and Jewish scholars, forget feminists and scholars, but also retaining what's distinctive about Judaism per se. Number two, from Martha Nussbaum. And here she writes, we need not give up our special affections and identifications, whether ethnic or gender-based or religious, but we should also work to make all human beings part of our community and dialogue of concern, and give the circle that defines our humanity special attention and respect. We shouldn't stop at ourselves. Think about the nested circles. We shouldn't stop at our family, shouldn't stop at Rodef Shalom, although Rabbi Bisno makes it very tempting to do that. We should also extend it beyond to all of humanity. And then finally, Michael McConnell, a legal scholar who writes, quoting Burke, drawing on it, a student, and we can think about ourselves, each of us as students, student who cares not a whit for his own culture's accomplishments is unlikely to find much value in the accomplishments of others. A student who has no religion is unlikely to respect the religious commitments of others. One who knows no heroes in his own land will feel nothing but contempt for the naivete of those who honor heroes elsewhere. Most important, before a child can learn to value others, he needs to learn to value. And that, in a sense, is what we are up to today and what we're here to do in the study and the cultivation of the work of DEI and our other work. Hold on one second, sorry. One small technical difficulty on my end. Just as a way of ending, one last thing that I didn't mention here. Inclusion and diversity do one other thing. They provide a check on power. Those who decide communal strategy and are at the table making decisions must include those who don't normally have power and influence for all the reasons we said. So here's how I want to conclude. This moment in time has propelled a record number of people to reflection and action. Whether from the news or simply the dinner table conversations, we have seen the power of this moment as a catalyst for action throughout our society. And that's equally true, not only in your community, but also at HUC. We're raising up our focus on the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, not simply as a rote institutional value, but I am personally committed to reflecting on and changing our culture to make real these values in the lives of the students we prepare, the staff and faculty who work there, and our board that oversees and partners and collaborates to strengthen our work. And we prepare those students that we do train to carry these core values into communities far and wide. To do this at HUC, we've committed ourselves to not one, but multiple prongs, multiple courses of actions, including the formation of a presidential task force very soon after I arrived 2 years ago, advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion at every level of HUC, from students to board members, and investing in student support and training. And this, just to say, is not a one and done. This is, we looked at it. We have work to do, and we are hard at work at it, and we have continued markers ahead to our progress. As hard as we might try, we can't do this alone. And you and communities like Rodef Shalom are our most important partners. You can help us recruit a diverse student body to meet the needs, spiritual and others, of communities in the future. You can share your thoughts and resources with us to make sure this happens. And your support of this effort is seen the exciting and dynamic Jewish future of our students. That support will help create. I hope you could form those words into a sentence that I was trying to say. So I thank you for what you have done, for what you're doing, your partnership in that future, and for the discussion that hopefully we can now have. Thank you so much for your time.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Andrew, for elucidating a complex subject and walking us through what DEI is and what it's founded upon, the tensions of these different values, and the fault lines and the difficulty, but the significance and importance of our navigating that path and bringing more people into the discussion as we do that. The decisions we make and the conversations we have are all the better, the more voices we have. I want to invite anyone who has questions to share them in the chat, or given the numbers that we have here, if you want to raise your hand, we can call on you also. I'm going to turn that over to Rabbi Elliot Kleinman to walk us through that.
The first question, how do we address the desire to create diverse boards without seeming racist in looking to have different groups involved?
Thank you, Elliot. Or thank you for the question. Look, so long as we stick to what is I think an understandable but imprecise definition of racism, which says we use in the group characteristics that an individual has, well, that's racism. And by definition, we're being racist, and there's no way to avoid it if that's how we're going to define it. But if instead we're looking for the purposes we're serving, we understand it's not for their tokenism that matters, but for very specific aims that their inclusion helps us achieve. We value them because they bring different interests to the group. We value them for their perspectives. We value them because, yes, they are role model. They are a beacon to others. They are a Nachshon, a person who goes first from the biblical story of crossing the Red Sea. And they're important because they help us make better decisions. So talk about the value to us. Don't tokenize them. Don't put them there and take pictures and that's it. Bring them in and make them full partners in that board, full partners in decision making, and really sharing power just like you would anybody else.
Laser Palnick has his hand up. Laser's from a rabbinic family, so point of privilege.
Hi. Thank you, Rabbi. And I enjoyed the talk very much. I want to follow up a little bit about along the same lines. How do you figure affirmative action in this, particularly in light of where you are going with respect to blind selection and things of that nature? How does affirmative action and a conscious effort to bring in inclusion fit together with all of this?
Maybe you won't be surprised. Is it Mr. Palnick? Or did you say Rabbi Palnick? I didn't catch the Dr. Palnick. Great Master Palnick. Nice to, it's an important question.
My father was Rabbi Palnick. I'm
okay.
a former civil rights lawyer myself.
So thank you for that service. Look, affirmative action is a contentious idea, but let's talk about the what we mean by affirmative action. I was going to say it won't come as any surprise to you, perhaps, given the way that I approach thinking, that I want to first ask you to define your terms. Do you mean giving extra weight to people in order to distribute goods and services to them? Like, and what is or a good being a scarce resource? And what is a college admission slot but a scarce resource? So if you view it in that way, I think that it sounds like you're playing favorites. But if instead you look at the purposes, the aims that we're aiming for diversity, that you want to create, for example, on a college campus, a diverse student body, not for the photo that you'll take of it, but in order to have a better discussion around a classroom table, when you have robust people from different experiences and backgrounds, it becomes a qualification for admission that you need a diverse group of people, a diverse community. I think one of the more contentious and challenging questions that people use affirmative action, that is giving extra weight to bring diversity or to distribute scarce goods, is when you're doing it to heal the past, for repairing the past. And I noted 4 values. That could be a 5th, and that certainly is one of the main ones for affirmative action. You know, here I would just say it depends. I think we need to look at the context. We need to look at the situation and ask, is giving access to resources today a good way of repairing the past, giving opportunity to those who were denied it? It certainly shouldn't be off the table, but I think in each case, it's going to be different. I'd ask you, what do you think about affirmative action? You're muted.
Thank you. So it keeps muting and unmuting. I think you hit it on it at the end of your answer just now when you talk about making some conscious efforts to resolve past inequities, and that becomes an important factor in your choices about how you move and go forward in your inclusion going as you work through this.
Great, thank you.
Andrew, we have a questioner who asks that as we make these kinds of changes, or as the legal process extends rights and protections to a wider array of citizens, are there not winners in that and losers? Is it not a zero-sum game? Are not the children in our religious schools, for example, the majority of whom are Ashkenazic and white, now meeting a more challenging environment competitively for admissions and for job opportunities? And how do we address that, the competing values? It makes a more perfect union, a more beloved community, and 2, it makes it more challenging for some in our midst.
Well, I mean, if you view things in terms, and sometimes they are winners and losers, and you're saying that if you have to diversify, that people that are winners now are going to lose, I'd say, why aren't you talking about all the people that you left out for years and decades and generations before? So, okay, if you frame it, and I know that you're not Aaron or whoever asked the question, but if you do see things as winners and losers, then let's create a fair playing field. And let's recognize that it hasn't been fair. And yeah, people who are now at the winner's table, maybe they don't belong. And so we need to have it a little more competitive. I tend not to look at the things in that way. I see things in terms of a multiplying effect rather than the zero-sum game. I think we're all better off. We will make better students by having a diverse population that can share. And by the way, one of the most important pieces of diversity, and I'll just challenge this community for that, not that I know your community in particular, but I'm applying to you a group sense. You're a member of the Union of Reformed Judaism, so I can make some presumptions. I can make some presumptions about how you voted. I can make some presumptions about your socioeconomic class as a group, not about individuals. But here's one thing that I'll say is that people that come into HUC tend to be much more in terms of liberal political views. And one of the things that our task force that we engaged in, and it's on the website with full transparency, is that some people with political views that aren't shared, whether it's on Israel or social issues, don't feel safe to share them in an honest way. And so I would say that I think that leaves our community less strong for that. I think that our rabbis, our students would be stronger if they had to confront if they were really able to, in a respectful way. We also have challenges that not everyone that engages with people that they disagree with do so in a respectful way. So both of those things have to happen. But Aaron, I think I tend not to think of these kind of diversity issues in terms of winners and losers, but really in the way that we all benefit and society benefits by creating a more diverse community.
Great, thank you.
Another question. If systemic racism, if we accept systemic racism, what is 1 or 2 things the Jewish community should be doing to begin to dismantle it?
Well, so systemic racism, let's again start with defining terms. This is the best, and I don't have one worked out in precision that I'd like to have, but the best the best kind of definition is something having to do with that the way that our system is structured produces impacts and has impacts in a disparate effect that tracks reliably by race, treating those who are not white with worse off outcomes. I'll give you an example. That's convoluted, I know, but it's very clear. It's not about psychological motivation. Systemic racism is what happens based on the way the system is designed, not necessarily any one particular's actions within it. That's what differs from individual racism. So the crack cocaine laws of the 1980s, or the 3 strikes you're out laws could be one too, that are, you make illegal a drug that is specific to that is higher use by one community, and therefore it's not powdered cocaine but crack cocaine. So what can you read the question again, Elliot? I think I got distracted by my own trying to work out the definition. I apologize.
If you accept systemic racism as a given,
yeah,
what are 1 or 2 things the Jewish community should do now to begin dismantling that system?
Well, so first of all, begin to ask it in our own communities. Are there systemic barriers to entry for people of color, particularly to our own communities, to LGBTQ communities, et cetera? And look at the rules, and it's going to differ within each institution. That's number one. Number two, work through organizations like the Religious Action Center in Washington of the Union of Reform Judaism, that is advocating for looking at our laws, our practices, to change the institutions to create a fairer and more just system. But there's so many places, policing is one example. Any number of places, but the thing is to track rules and not necessarily the individual's decision making, and you'll get a lot of traction. It's the opposite of imposing screens. It's taking them down when they are discriminating.
Hang on. Okay, good. I'm going to wrap up. I want to thank you, Andrew Rayfield, for this enlightening, provocative, and really incredibly thoughtful, and raises the bar for us as we approach this important conversation. So I thank you. I thank your team at the Hebrew Union College, with whom it is such a pleasure to pull this together and to work, in particular Rabbi Elliot Kleinman. We thank you. Our partners at the Women of Reform Judaism, we're grateful to you, and our friends in Chicago at Sketchpad. That's over and above everyone at Road of Shalom congregation and the Levar family who made this possible, and everyone for joining us this evening. On behalf of all of us here in Pittsburgh, we're very grateful. Please know that the recording of this, it will be available, as well as a transcript of the chat, should you wish to have that as well. And we look forward to many other opportunities to discuss important topics, to learn together, and to be inspired by the thought leadership coming out of the Hebrew Union College. Andrew Rayfield, thank you. Of our family, we thank you.